So I want to start today's episode by painting a scene, and I want you to consider if any of this sounds familiar. Let's say that you're on holidays, or maybe you're supposed to be on holidays, but you're physically there, but mentally you're somewhere else. It's a place that cost you a lot of money to get to, and it also took a lot of time to organize, and you're surrounded by the people that you love and care for. But you're also distracted. You're checking on deals that are in progress. You're texting with clients. You're answering questions from the office that could have been handled without you, but haven't been. And those people who you love and care for have stopped commenting on it. Not because they're cool with you being disengaged while you're on holidays, but they don't comment because they've learnt that commenting on it doesn't really change anything. Or maybe the scene for you is a bit different. Perhaps you're at a school event. I attended my daughter's assembly last week as she picked up a recognition award, and I made sure I got there on time and that I didn't look at my phone at all. But maybe it's a little bit different for you. Maybe you don't ever quite get there mentally. Maybe there's a conversation that you've been having with your partner that you both know how is going to end. Or maybe it's a Sunday morning where you're doing something for the business when you told yourself that last Sunday you wouldn't be working on Sunday. Now, I'm not describing anyone who is failing, and I'm not describing a person who's leading a business that isn't winning. It's probably a business that's doing great, but it's doing it on terms that have stopped working for the person who's running it. And that is what today's episode is all about. Welcome to episode 272 of Commercial Real Estate Leadership. My name is Darren Krakowiak, and I help commercial real estate principals to build an agency that can run without them, so they have the choice to work on or off the tools. And in today's episode, I want to talk about something that you won't hear talked about on other podcasts. In fact, it's not something that I typically talk about. And it's the specific guilt that comes with being a successful commercial real estate principal who also wants something to change even though they are successful. It's not the guilt of failure or of not having tried hard enough. You might remember what that feels like, or maybe you've avoided it long enough that you've forgotten. This is a different thing. This is the guilt of looking at a business that is objectively doing well, but also at the same time thinking, this is taking more from me than it's giving me. And it's the feeling like you're not allowed to think that, let alone say it. Because our industry, the commercial real estate industry, has a special relationship with exhaustion. Exhaustion is proof that you're serious. It's evidence that you care. And the person who's always available, who's always across all the details, who's always the first one to arrive in the office, that person is respected. The person who says they want more time off, well, that sounds like someone whose hunger has gone and who doesn't care as much as they should. So you don't say you feel exhausted. At least you don't say it out loud, and you certainly don't say it to people in the industry. Maybe you don't even think it to yourself, or maybe not in those words. But the feeling is there, and it tends to come out in unproductive ways. It might be a slightly shorter fuse at the end of the day. It might be in the deals that you're handling that you know you shouldn't, but you just can't say no to. Maybe it's in the Sunday morning when you open the laptop when you told yourself it would only be for 20 minutes, but you find yourself there for hours on end. Now, if that rings true, here's what I want to say. Wanting the business to require less of you is not the same as wanting to work less hard. Those are two different things. But the culture in our industry has kind of collapsed them into one. And that collapse is costing you because it makes the real problem harder to name. So if the problem isn't that you've lost your drive, and it isn't that you're ungrateful for what you've built, what is the problem? I think it's actually simpler than most people make it. And it's really just structural. When I work with a commercial real estate principal who is at this point, they're successful, but they're tired and they're not sure how to change things without the wheels completely coming off. The first thing I want to understand from them is, what specifically is the business asking of you that it should be able to do for itself? Because what I've noticed is that the exhaustion isn't evenly distributed. It's not that everything in the business is hard. It's just that there's a specific set of things that could and should be handled without the principal that keep coming back to the principal. And that set of things is large enough and recurring enough that over time it crowds out the work that actually energizes you. So here's one way to think about it. Every business has an energy budget. And in most of the commercial real estate agencies that I work with, The principal is the most significant source of energy. The team draws from the principal. The clients draw from the principal. The decisions all come from the principal. And the principal has no reliable way to replenish their energy because the business never fully stops drawing energy from them. Now, this isn't a motivation problem, and it's certainly not a weakness. It's just what happens when a business has grown to a size where one person can no longer be the only source of energy, the only source of momentum. And the structure of the business, the way it's set up, hasn't quite caught up. As I said in last week's episode, if this rings true, it doesn't mean you've built a bad business. It just means you're in the middle of building a business that hasn't been finished yet. And that exhaustion feeling is the business's way of telling you that your work building is not quite done. Now, the commercial real estate principals at this point know that something needs to change, but what stops them isn't awareness of the problem. It's more often than not a specific belief that they're hanging on to. And I hear it almost all the time in the first conversations I have with someone about this situation. And it goes something like this. I know I should step back from things. I know I should let go, but if I do, the revenue will fall. So let's examine that belief because I think it's worth testing. So the belief is stepping back means revenue drops. I think when most principals say that, they're not making a general statement. They're pointing at one of three specific things that are going on in the business. So let's find out what those things are. Let's name them. Let's talk about them because they're all real, but none of them are unsolvable. Now, the first one is client relationships. When you have clients who have, your number, who call you specifically, who would notice, and not in a good way, if someone else started handling their work, that's a real problem, okay? And those relationships are genuinely personal and they're genuinely valuable. But they're also a structural liability because they're not transferable. And if you're not available, the client's experience kind of degrades. That's a problem, but it's also a solvable one. It requires a deliberate process of introducing your team into those relationships over time, not handing them off, introducing, okay? There's a difference. The second one is deal context, and these are the deals that are in progress right now where you're the only person who has the full picture. You know what the vendor wants. You know what the buyer is asking for underneath what they're actually saying. You know where the deal can stretch and where it can't. And if you stepped out, the context would be lost. Again, a real problem, but also one that's solvable. The context that lives in your head is a documentation and briefing problem. It's not permanent dependency. Now, the third one is about your team's capability, the third problem. You don't fully trust that your team can handle everything without you. But let's be clear about this. That might be the case because you haven't given them the opportunity to do that yet. Every time a situation gets serious, you come back in. And that means your team has never actually had to develop the capability that you're worried that they don't have. The dependency you're afraid of may partly be a product of the very behavior you're considering changing. Now, none of these things mean that you should ignore the risk and step back immediately, but they do mean that the belief, if I step back, revenue drops, is not a fixed fact about your business. It's a description of the current state of your business. And here's an important point. The current state can be changed. I use the phrase off the tools with a number of my clients, and I have started using it in my positioning, as you may have noticed at the top of the episode. And I want to be specific about what I mean when I say off the tools because, I don't want to be misunderstood. Off the tools is not retirement. It's not stepping back from commercial real estate or handing over your client relationships to someone else or becoming just a figurehead in your own business who's sitting in the departure lounge. I'm not describing any of that. What I'm describing is a business that can produce without requiring your presence at every single point of a deal, of a client relationship, of a back-end process. One where the team can run the day-to-day without escalating every little decision to you that they could be making themselves. Where you're doing the deals you genuinely want to do, the ones that are interesting, the ones that are meaningful, the ones that are worth your time, with the clients that you actually love to work with by choice, not because the business will stall or go backwards if you don't. Now, that distinction, doing deals with clients you love by choice and not by necessity, that's the whole thing, right? That's what changes when a business has been completely and properly built out. I had a client who took 5 weeks away from his business a couple of years ago. first extended absence he'd ever taken. And he was really, really worried about it. I'm not talking about between Christmas and Australia Day. I'm talking about in the middle of the year. He thought it was going to be a disaster. But what happened was he came back to a business that had run without him. And his team had been making decisions that they previously would have escalated, with clients having been serviced by people other than him. Didn't go perfectly, by the way, but it went well enough. I've got another client who's about to head off on a 6-week trip in a caravan around Australia with his family. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how he goes. But the reflection from this client who previously had the 5-week trip was that the 5 weeks told him more about what he needed to change in the business than the previous 5 years of being in it every day. That's what being off the tools looks like. Not absence, not irrelevance, it's optionality. The business runs and you choose where to show up. So I want to give you something practical to take away from today, because understanding why you're exhausted is useful, but it's not really enough on its own. What is more useful is knowing specifically where the exhaustion is coming from. So I want to walk you through the 3 energy drains. These are the 3 structural conditions that I see consuming the most energy in commercial real estate principles when I first start working with them. And in most of the businesses that I get some exposure into or some visibility into, I see at least 2 of these 3 are active, and sometimes it's all 3 of them. So the first one is what I call the unnecessary deal. This is the transaction that you took on because you just can't say no, because you're a deal junkie who doesn't yet have a get out of bed fee. And you do this deal not because it was the best use of your time, not because it genuinely interested you, not because it was strategically important. You took it because the client asked, and because it would have been awkward to decline, or because some part of you still needs to be the one who does that deal. Now, these deals rarely kill you overnight. It's just one deal, right? But what they do is they sit in your week and they pull at the edges of everything else. The calls after hours because the vendor has questions. The inspections that you can't get out of when you should be doing something else more important for your business. The fee that when you calculate what you actually put in is really not very impressive when you look at what you're earning per hour. Now, the unnecessary deal is particularly hard to address because saying no to a deal often feels counterintuitive for someone who's built their business by saying yes, by someone who is building a business that they want to see grow. But not all deals are created equal, and some of the ones consuming most of your time and energy are the ones that should have been done by your team rather than handled by you. The second drain is the decision queue. Now, this is what I talked about last week as the escalation trap, but I want to describe it today in terms of what it costs you energetically rather than just structurally. So have a think about your last few days at work. How many times did someone come to you with a question or a problem that you answered immediately? Probably a few times, right? And most of those interactions felt fine. They were quick, they were normal, but what each of them actually cost you is a small micro withdrawal from your attention and focus. Individually, they seem harmless. They're nothing, right? But cumulatively, over a 5-day period, over a 28 days of work in a month, or, cumulatively, you're acquiring all of these cognitive switching penalties, right? They add up to something that actually feels a lot like being perpetually interrupted from anything that requires more than a moment's thought. Now, the decision queue is a little bit insidious because each individual item in it seems pretty reasonable. Of course, you're going to answer that quick question from a team member. Of course, you're going to weigh in on a matter that will impact the outcome for a client. But it's only when you look at the week as a whole or the month in its entirety that you realize that you haven't had a period of uninterrupted thought, of clear white space to do some deep thinking in longer than you can remember. And that's where the strategy for making real change lives, in those uninterrupted blocks. And that's why the decision queue is not just an energy drain, but it's also a limit on your growth. The third drain is the one that maybe might be hardest to talk about because it's built from something that looks like a strength. I want to call it the relationship hostage. So you have clients, probably some of your most important clients, the ones who helped you get your business to where it is today, and they have a relationship with you personally, not just with your business. They trust you, they call you when something matters, they want you on it. And that trust is real and is valuable, and you've earned it over many years. But here's the structural reality and impact of that. Every client whose relationship is entirely personal to you is a client the business cannot properly service when you're not available. And every deal in that category is a deal where your absence creates a genuine risk to the outcome. Those clients are not assets to the business, they're assets to you personally. And that means that they don't belong to the business really, they just belong to you. And when you eventually decide to change how you operate, or when something forces that change, those relationships are going to be the hardest and the most difficult and expensive things to transition. So calling them relationship hostages is suitable because the dependency runs both ways. They depend on you and you depend on them depending on you, which makes it harder for both parties to break free. So they're the three energy drains: the unnecessary deal, the decision queue, and the relationship hostage. My question for you before we wrap up this episode is, which one of those three is costing you the most right now? You don't have to answer the question out loud, but I encourage you to sit with it because the answer will probably tell you where you should start. So I want to wrap up the episode today with something that I believe to be true because I've said it enough times that it's no longer a hope, it's an observation. You can still love the deals. You can still be the best operator in your market. You can still have the client relationships that matter most to you. And you can do the work that is genuinely interesting and be proud of what the business produces. You just can't keep doing all of it yourself. Not the way that you're doing it now. Not if you want a business that will grow and for you to still be standing as it does. The exhaustion feeling is a sign not that something is wrong with you, it's a sign that the business has reached a point where it needs to be finished, properly structured, not just grown. And there's a big difference between a business that has grown and a business that is complete, a real business, not just a high-paying job. The unnecessary deals, the decision queue, the relationship hostages, these are not permanent features of running a commercial real estate agency. They're structural conditions that were created at a certain stage of the business and have just not yet been addressed. They can be changed. It takes some focus, it takes some intention, it takes time. But it's not that complicated, right? It's a switch in some beliefs. It's a changing of perspective. And on the other side of it is exactly what you said you wanted when you started the business in the first place. If today's episode resonated with you, I want to ask you one more question before we shut it down. And the question is this: what would need to be true about your business for you to be able to take, let's say, 3 weeks away from it without a crisis happening? I'm not talking about between Christmas and Australia Day, 3 weeks in the middle of the year. Now, you might not quite know what the answer is now, but I just encourage you not to dismiss the question, but to have a think about it. What would need to be true about your business for you to be able to take 3 weeks away from it without there being a crisis? Because the gap between where your business is now and a place where that question has a real answer, that gap is the work, and it's definitely workable and solvable. If you'd like to have a think through what it looks like in your business specifically, let's have that conversation. You can find me on LinkedIn, Darren Krakowiak, send me a message. My name's in the show notes. Tell me a bit about where things are. It's not going to be a high pressure pitch or a process, just a conversation. And yeah, let's see if we can solve one of those issues in your business soon. That's our episode for today. Thank you so much for listening. I will speak to you soon.